Now let's move into the cerebrum. And instead of starting from the bottom and working my way up, this time I'm going to start from the top and work my way down. So we'll start with the cerebral cortex. And as we've discussed before, the cortex means bark. And it is anywhere from 1 to 4 millimeters, depending on the source. Some sources say 2 to 5 millimeters thick. And it's the outer covering of gray matter, so cell bodies, some dendritic fields, and so forth. And this is going to be where all of your processing, conscious processing, and higher thought is going to occur. So the cortex will vary depending on the region of the brain, and also it will change with age. So sometimes as people get older, the cortex gets thinner, and sometimes with disease process, certain areas of the cortex will also get thinner. Now the cortex obviously has these foldings and these undulations, and we have these gyri, and these are these rounded convexities or undulations in the cortex that are increasing the surface area. And the sulci are those valleys in between. So those are the shallow grooves between the gyri. We also have some fissures, which are deeper grooves. So they're deeper than the sulci, but they will be segregating the major brain areas. Now, under the cortex, we're going to have bundles of myelinated axons. And these axons are going to be carrying information from one area to another. And a lot of these white matter tracts will be traveling throughout the CNS. And we're going to have some of them that are ascending, some of them that are descending, some of them that are traveling sort of longitudinally, and some that are traveling locally. And we will see that there are subcortical regions that are deep to the cortex that are mostly white matter tracts. Between them, we will have some nuclei, like our basal nuclei that we discussed before. But our white matter tracts are going to be conveying information from one area to another. And as you recall, our white matter tracts are myelinated axons. So if we want to look at the types of white matter tracts that we see within the cerebrum and within the central nervous system, we'll look at some that we see in the cerebrum. So we have the smaller white matter tracts that are going to run from one region of the cerebrum, from the cerebral cortex to another. We have very short fibers that are basically like local couriers. They're going to be carrying messages from maybe one gyrus to another. And these are called arcuate fibers because they make an arc. They make an arc from the cortex in the convexity of one gyrus around the sulcus to the gyrus next to it, and hence the term arcuate fibers. So these are very short fibers. And then we have slightly longer fibers called longitudinal fasciculi. And these are also a type of association fiber. And what they do is they're going to interconnect regions of the brain, not just local regions, but maybe different brain areas and different lobes of the brain. Then we're going to have types of white matter that act as bridges between the two hemispheres of the brain. So this is going to be very important because we'll see that we have two separate hemispheres that are going to act as a whole structure. And if we did not have these commissures, then what we would have would be two separate consciousnesses residing in the two hemispheres of the brain. One of the major commissures that we have is called the corpus callosum. And that's this big band of white matter that we see that surrounds, it's over the top of the ventricles, it's over the top of the thalamus. We also have one called the anterior commissure, and that's in the front. There's another one called the posterior commissure that we're not really going to cover, but it's similar and it's in the posterior part of the brain. And then, of course, we have our projection fibers. And these are going to be running like a north-south highway with both ascending projections from the spinal cord and inferior structures that will be bringing information from the periphery. And a lot of these will be going through this thalamus. And these will bringing information up to the cerebrum. And so these are bringing what we call ascending information, sensory information from these lower structures, and also bringing information from the periphery to the cerebral cortex. By the same token, the cerebral cortex will be sending information to these lower structures. So we will have descending information. So back to my analogy of the north-south superhighway, we've got some connections that are flowing from the cerebral cortex through brainstem structures and down to the spinal cord. So for example, you recall when we talked about the pyramids that are going to cross at the medulla oblongata. These are white matter tracts that are carrying information from the cerebral cortex to the spinal cord, which will convey motor commands to the skeletal muscles. Now that we've looked at some of the important tracts that are linking the cerebrum with other central nervous system structures, let's look at some of the defining features that we see on the cerebral hemispheres. Now we've got some major landmarks when we look at the hemispheres. We can see this giant longitudinal fissure, and that's going to separate the two hemispheres along the mid-sagittal plane. Then we're going to have something called the transverse cerebral fissure, and this is going to separate the cerebrum from the cerebellum, so it runs sort of posterior here. Then we have the lateral sulcus. This is also called the Sylvian fissure. It has a couple of names, but the lateral sulcus is going to separate the temporal lobe from the parietal and frontal lobes in each hemisphere. And if we look at one of our other major landmarks, we have the central sulcus, which is going to be the border between the frontal and the parietal lobes. Then we're going to have the parieto-occipital sulcus, which is going to be the border between the parietal and occipital cortices. And we can see this easiest in the mid-sagittal view. Now, as we have seen, we've studied from lab where the different lobes are, and we know that they're pretty much seated underneath the bone that bears their name. So, for example, the occipital sulcus is going to be deep to the occipital bone. The parietal lobes on either side are going to be deep to the parietal bones, and the frontal lobe is going to be deep to the frontal bone, and we have the temporal lobe on either side, which is going to be deep to the temporal bones. So in terms of naming the lobes, it's pretty much anatomically where they sit underneath their bones. So we have two hemispheres. There's a left hemisphere and there's a right hemisphere, and over evolution they have sort of evolved to specialize in different things. So for example, our left hemisphere is more involved with mathematical calculation and logical decision making. We also have our language specialization in the left hemisphere. So we're going to have an area called the Broca's area or speech area, the Broca's motor speech area, and that's going to be very important for planning movements to produce intelligible speech. We will also have another area called Wernicke's area, and this is going to be very important for speech recognition and comprehension, both speech and the written word, so reading as well. So these areas are localized in the left hemispheres in most people. There is a statistical deviation in that about 2% of left-handed people will have these areas in the right side of their brain. We will also see that people who have suffered some kind of trauma or have maybe had epilepsy from an early age, sometimes these structures will migrate over to the right hemisphere if those structures are damaged early on. And unfortunately, this can only be accommodated up to about age 10 because the brain is very much plastic at this point in time. So it's very much able to learn new stuff and rewire itself. But after the age of 10, some of these processes are quite a bit more difficult to do. And so it's very difficult to rewire areas of the brain to other areas if the original areas become damaged. Now, in the right hemisphere, we have the ability to recognize objects through sensory perception. So we can also interpret 3D spatial relationships. We can also analyze emotional content of speech. So we can see a lot of people call the right brain the intuitive brain and the left brain the logical brain, which isn't entirely the case, but there are specializations that reside in each of the two hemispheres. Now, when we look at the lobes themselves, we find that the lobes have specializations. So, for example, the frontal lobe will be involved in decision-making, planning, assessing actions and consequences to actions, and these kinds of things. And this is one of the reasons why it's so strongly interconnected with limbic structures and the hippocampus and areas that are important for emotional processing. Because as we've said before, a lot of your decision-making will be based on what the consequences of those decisions are and how they are going to affect you. Is it going to be a pleasant or an unpleasant consequence? And obviously you're going to avoid the things that would create an unemotional, unpleasant experience and try to do the things that will create reward or give you an emotionally pleasant experience. We have also within the frontal lobes, we have in an area called the Precentral Gyrus, so named because it's right in front of that central sulcus. an area that is going to be where we're going to have the primary motor cortex. And the primary motor cortex is going to be sending commands to skeletal muscles. This will be a two-step process. There will be large, what we call pyramidal neurons in the primary motor cortex, whose axons cross in the pyramids of the medulla oblongata. And so this is the pyramidal system. And these axons will synapse somewhere in the spinal cord, and these will basically innervate skeletal muscle. So the neurons arising from the spinal cord that were synapsed on by the pyramidal neurons from the primary motor cortex will innervate skeletal muscle. We also have some motor neurons from the premotor cortex that will innervate skeletal muscle directly, and a lot of them will also be working with neurons in the primary motor cortex to plan motor movements. So the premotor cortex is where we're going to plan motor movements, and we can think about and rehearse motor movements and motor plans before we actually execute them. So for example, if you're a musician and you're about to go out on stage and play your guitar or your violin or piano or whatever, you can be sitting in the green room thinking about playing these pieces that you're going to play for your recital or whatever. And if someone were monitoring your brain activity, they would actually see a lot of activity within the premotor cortex as you were thinking about the motor movements that you were actually about to execute. Now, the prefrontal cortex is going to sit in front of the premotor cortex. And this is going to be where we're going to have a lot of our abstract intelligence and our long-term planning, higher thinking, decision-making. So this is where we'll be able to abstract the consequence of something that we do based on our previous experiences. So we have seen the idea of action and consequence before. So if we steal the cookies out of the cookie jar, we probably will be reprimanded by our parents and so forth. And these experiences that we have will then allow us in future situations that are similar, we can sort of abstract what the consequences of our actions might be in a given circumstance. Now let's move to the parietal cortex. The parietal cortex is going to have the major sensory areas in it. So in the post-central gyrus, or this gyrus that is directly behind the central sulcus, we will be receiving sensory information from the body through the peripheral nervous system. So basically we'll be sensing information about pain, touch, temperature, what we call somatic sensation. And these will be, of course, relayed through the thalamus up to the primary somatosensory cortex. And then we're going to have some sensory association areas that are right behind this primary somatosensory cortex that will help us integrate some of these sensations with sensations coming from other modalities. So we will be able to construct memories and ideas about something, not just their physical sensation when you touch them, but also combine that with visual information, auditory information, and so forth to give us the complete concept of an object that we're dealing with. Now let's look at the temporal lobe. The temporal lobe is going to have the primary auditory cortex, and that's going to be in an area called the superior temporal gyrus, and there's an area within it called Heschl's gyrus. This is going to be receiving the information from the ears about tone, about auditory stimuli. So we're going to have within the primary auditory cortex the raw information coming from our hearing, but then we're going to have auditory association areas that are going, once again, to put together the raw stimuli, the raw auditory stimuli, into a complete sound picture, if you will. So if we're listening to a symphony orchestra, we'll get the raw pitches, the raw sounds, but somewhere in our association areas, we can start to distinguish melodies, we can distinguish who's playing what, so what the oboes are playing versus what the violins are playing versus what the brass section is playing, and so forth. We also have a very important area of association area called Wernicke's area. And this area spans the posterior part of the superior temporal gyrus along with some of our parietal areas, kind of overlaps. And this area will vary from individual to individual, but it's basically within that region. And we've looked at it before, and this is that Wernicke's area. And this is the one that's in the left hemisphere in the majority of people. And this is the one that's going to allow us to interpret both written words and speech. So interestingly, Wernicke's area will interpret language, regardless of what language that you may be hearing. If it's a language that you know and understand, then Wernicke's area will basically become active when you hear this language or reading in this language so that you understand what you're actually hearing or reading. Now let's look deep into the cortex, and we can see two structures in here that are going to be important. We're going to see the insula, and the insula is an area that's sort of covered over by the temporal lobe and the parietal and frontal lobes, and you'll have to retract back the temporal lobe at the lateral sulcus in order to see it. The insula is going to be receiving information about gustation or taste information. Another area that I would like to point out that is on the temporal lobe is actually in this superior medial surface here on the inside that you couldn't really see much from the outside is going to be our olfactory cortex. And this is going to be processing information from the nose. So basically sensorial information relating to smell.